Welcome, everyone, to another exciting AFSI Zoom meeting. I'm Judy Friedman-Kadish, Director of Americans for a Safe Israel, also known as AFSI. We work to educate the public about the real Israel, the one the mainstream media hides, and give you our beliefs about what will make Israel a strong and safe Jewish state. Last session, we were honored to bring you Nadia Matar, who spoke about the need for sovereignty and judicial reform from an activist viewpoint. She was careful not to answer any questions which would best be left to an attorney. So, AFSI is pleased to present Attorney Yotam Eyal, CEO of the Legal Forum of Israel. Yotam has just returned to Israel from a successful speaking tour in the US, where he addressed lay people and attorneys alike, engaging them for hours over the current issues in Israel. We spoke with him and believe he will bring a new understanding of the situation to this audience. Through legal measures and public opinion, his organization, the Legal Forum of Israel, works to safeguard the interests of the Jewish people in the state of Israel. One area of their expertise is Israel's judicial system. They are a non-governmental organization, NGO, that engages 400 volunteer lawyers to protect the Jewish Zionist and Democratic identity of Israel. The left in Israel says the country is facing the end of democracy, and that the judicial reforms underway now are dangerous for the people of Israel. They believe Israeli democracy is doomed. Nevertheless, the new government is moving full speed ahead with desperately needed and long overdue reforms that will serve to strengthen and restore Israel's democracy. Yotam will give us the legal rationale that supports these reforms. Yotam Eyal specializes in constitutional law. Over the last 8 years, he's been involved in many legislative proceedings, appeared dozens of times before the Knesset in different committees, and has written many legal opinions which were submitted to the Knesset and the government. He has published dozens of articles on current legal issues in Israel. He appears frequently on radio and television on matters related to the legal system and has a regular segment on the Knesset channel, the official broadcast of Israel's Knesset. We are thrilled to bring to you today Yotam Eyal. Yotam, it's all yours.
Thank you, Judy. And I'm very honored to have the option to come and speak in front of all of you. So thank everyone for coming. When we start thinking about the judicial reform, we need to ask ourselves, the first question is how we got into the point that a judicial reform, the judicial system is actually an issue that's so interesting the people in Israel. Usually when I ask people from any other state about their judicial system, they don't know even how the judicial system works. They doesn't know who is the people in the judicial system. And this is a system that most of the people doesn't care about. In Israel, it became the #1 issue that we have in Israel, an issue that taking hundreds of thousands of people in the streets of Israel to demonstrate about this issue. And in order for understanding how we got into the point that the judicial system is so interesting and so powerful, and so that people want to, and we have judicial reform, but so interesting people, we need first of all to start in the beginning of Israel. So let's go to 48. When Israel got established in 48, when you establish a state, you need to make certain rules. These rules in some places have a name, a constitution, but Israel never had a constitution. The reason that Israel never had a constitution was because Israel is combined from different minorities. And these minorities have a lot of issues that went from two sides but can't get into agreement about these issues. For example, let's take the Haredic people, the ultra-Orthodox people in Israel, and the secular people in Israel, and see what they said about the Shabbat, how Israel supposed to act in Shabbat as a state. Will you can drive in a public transport, or you can't drive in public transport? Will you can go? You will be serving the army. The army will be Orthodox, or will not be an Orthodox. All these issues came from in 48, and with still issues that we are dealing right now. But in 48, these issues made the government decide, the Knesset decide not to have a constitution. The idea was that if we can't make a constitution, we will take it between the years, and the Knesset, the first Knesset, but David Ben-Gurion was the head of the government at this time. He says the next Knesset will decide what will be the constitution. And when this question came to the Knesset, they said they said again, let's take it to the next Knesset, and we'll never had a Knesset, but actually decide to make a constitution till today, because these issues are still issues that we are dealing with. So Israel doesn't have a constitution, but Israel made a system that eventually is supposed to be a constitution. And this system called the Basic Law of Israel, the base law of Israel. This base law have three types of base law. Usually we have a regular laws. These laws are, for example, how the criminal law, the civil law. This law is regular law, but getting changed usually. But the base law are laws, but the government says, and the parliament says when he enact them, when he did them, he said this law will eventually will take a part in the constitution. This is why we call them a base law. And there are three different types of this law. The first one is about the structure of the state. For example, how we can appoint a president, how we can appoint a prime minister, and what will be the Knesset, how you can elect to the Knesset in Israel. That's law are base law in Israel. The other part of the base law is about about the flag, about the anthem of Israel, about the symbols of Israel as a state. And that's another part. And the last part is about the values of the state. When we're going about the question about the values of the state, now we have a little problem, because which value will be the value of the state for years? And this question is, because it's so complicated, no one actually made base laws about values until 1992. At 1992 was two base law about values. The first one is the human dignity law, base law, and the second one is the right about occupation, about to work in whatever you want. These two base law the Knesset was written them in 92, and when they decide to do laws about the values, so they have a lot of problems, and when they did them, so one of the main problems that they have was about the right of everyone to be to have the same. I forgot the term. Sorry about it. About the equity, about how you can everyone have the same right to be, for example, to take shivyon. If someone have the word about shivyon, I just forget the term. So about the rights about everyone have the same rights in Israel. And this question have a major argument. And why? Because for example, if you can take someone, he said, will the women, all the women have rights, have the same rights as all the men. That's something that we all can agree about. But when we're getting into the points about, for example, who will be serving in the army, so now the question is becoming little harder. Now, for example, will the women serve the same time in the army as the men in the army of Israel? Will the women have the same they need to have in the same places in the army. For example, will be in the most elite unit. That question is something but the Knesset can't agree about, so they decide to put this issue out of the subjects. What happened, and now I'm going to jump 3 years later. 3 years later, one case is coming to the Supreme Court. This case is about a bank called Mizrahi, a bank that hold money, and they have a civil case against some settlement that they have argued about some money, whose the land belong to, and who need to pay for the rest, or another. Very boring issue, and it came to the justice, to the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court was decide whatever it decided of, but one of the judges that was in the Supreme Court was named Aaron Barak. Aaron Barak, when he wrote the decision about this case, he wrote a decision. His ruling was around 360 pages about this case. In the page 260 or something in this area, he wrote one sentence: I have the right to disqualify laws of the Knesset because the base laws giving me these rights. Now, suddenly, we are in a different place in Israel, because till today, the Supreme Court never got from the parliament the option to overrule its decisions. Now, suddenly, the Supreme Court says, I have the option to overrule your decisions. By which laws? By the laws that I decide that be giving me these rights. And if we're going back to the major issue that we have right now in the Supreme Court, this is the best example to the main issue. Because what happened is that now we have constitutional disagreement about what's the rules of the Supreme Court in Israel. And since 95, the Supreme Court took slowly, actually it's not so slowly, but it took more and more power to himself. It starts from disqualify laws of the Knesset. Eventually, it came to a point that the Supreme Court came to people, to the Knesset, and says, you have to make a law by what we're going to define you. That means is not only disqualify laws, is actually decide which laws the parliament will make. And that thing becomes so problematic, because when we're going to the definition of democratic state, and we start thinking about what is democratic state, the first rule in democracy is that the people have the option to influence on the state, to put their values on the state. And how we doing it? How we can put our influence on the state? By going to the election and represent and choosing our representative in the parliament. And this parliament have a right to make values, but these values will be the values of a state. But suddenly we got into a place that the Supreme Court is actually decide about what is the values of a state. And the Supreme Court is not elected by the public. And that's the thing that I'm going to explain right now, because this is the first issue in the reform, is about how you electing judges into the Supreme Court. In Israel, there is a committee. This committee is combined from 9 members, 2 ministers, 2 MK members, 2 bar association members, and 3 Supreme Court judges. Now, in order to appoint a judge into the Supreme Court, we have to have the agreement of at least 7 members of the committee. That means, let's go and look about who is appointing the judges. That means that the Supreme Court judges that are in the committee of appointing judges have a veto right about who will be appointed to the Supreme Court. And for years, what happened is that the Supreme Court put a veto on every candidate to the Supreme Court that it doesn't like. And what happened eventually, but if we look now on the Supreme Court judges, we will see that in the last 30, 40 years, there is a group of people that doesn't represent the public, that are representing themselves, doesn't have the same value as the public in the election, and they decide whatever they want, but by their own views. And I'm gonna now tell you a story about myself, because how I got into this area. So in 2005, there was, I'm sure all of you remember about the evacuation of Gush Katif. So Ariel Sharon decided to make evacuation of around 10,000 people from the houses in Gaza Strip and in Gush Katif and in the north of the Shomron, of Samaria in Israel. And I was actually a pretty young guy, probably much younger than most of you. And I was 16 years old. And as a citizen, I said, this is something so bad that I need to go and protest. So I went into protest. When I went into a protest, I went into the roads, and I actually block a road. I sat on a road and stopped cars from coming. And what happened is that I got arrested, because when you are doing something against the law, you're getting arrested. But I wasn't the only one that got arrested. I was arrested with other hundreds of people. Some of them didn't do anything. Some of them was doing something non-violent like me. And I got hit very hard from policemen. And eventually I was in jail for 48 hours. I wasn't even seen a judge. I was just sitting in a jail. I didn't have the option to represent myself before of the court. They actually choose a lawyer to represent myself without asking me, and eventually I was released from jail. And when we look on this thing, we said how we got into the point that all our civil rights, all the things that everyone has the right for example, to represent yourself in front of the court, are disappeared. After evacuation of Gush Katif, the numbers was revealed. Before Gush Katif, 6,000 people got arrested by the police. 700 was criminal charges against them. And some of them was kids, even younger than me. For example, one kid was 14 years old, and her case came into the Supreme Court, because when they got arrested, the judge in the case, in the regular court, they said we need to release her because she's young, and the prosecution didn't want to release her. So what they did, they went into appeal against another one, and got into the Supreme Court. And when they got into the Supreme Court, a Supreme Court judge says, she's so dangerous to the public because she demonstrated against the evacuation of Gush Katif that I need to put her in jail for a week. So this girl, 14 years old, sat in jail for around 3 weeks in jail, just because of demonstrating didn't hurt anyone. That things came regularly. And what we saw that there was the justice system actually wasn't only supporting the government, they actually took a step and decide to hurt us. And I'm gonna go few months later. I don't know if you all knows about, but few months later, there was evacuation of another place in Israel. And this place named Amona. Amona was a small settlement by Ofra in Binyamin region. And Amona had 9 houses. And what happened is that Olmert, that just replaced Sharon, because Sharon was healed and he need to replace him. So Olmert, that just replaced him, says we need to teach these settlers, you need to teach them that they can't do whatever they want. So he gave an order to the policemen that evacuate the Amona to make sure that the settlers not gonna be demonstrate anymore. The results of Amona was around 260 injured settlers and a few policemen. The most severe injured policeman was lost his eye because he broke a window and the glass got into his eye. He broke a window in order to go to and take people from houses, and he got to an eye. But the settlers, around 260 people, from very minor injuries to most severe one. The most severe one was actually 15 years old, but was clinical dead because the policeman broke his skull. This 15 years old is my younger brother, and this guy today is good, and because I know everyone asking it, so eventually today is good, is actually doing a very good thing for Israel. But what happened is that we tried to find out who is the policeman to put him on a trial, because policemen, but sending a kid to hospital, or in luck to a hospital, because you can actually send him to the jail, to a grave. So we have a fortune, but he didn't get into this point. So so this policeman, we tried to find who he is, and we didn't have option to find it. And you know how many policemen was actually convicted, or even putting on a trial after Amona? 2 policemen. One is actually got promoted on his role. So what we saw, that there is a system, and this system is, the judicial system is so powerful, but is actually taking power against the civilian and do whatever they want. Doesn't care about human rights. Obviously, our human rights was, no one kept on our human rights. Do whatever they want, and taking the power. And when we look on the people on the Supreme Court, we saw that everyone came from the same group of people that doesn't represent the public. And it wasn't only the Supreme Court; it's coming also to the prosecution and the legal attorney in Israel. But the legal attorney is the most strong clerk in the world. The very known professor says it. Why? Because the legal advisor of the government is also the head of a prosecution, and he can actually say today, by the definition, he can say to the government, but he doesn't allow to represent himself in front of the court, and he will say whatever he wants. I mean, he take the first thing that every person have to represent himself, so the government in Israel can represent himself in front of the Supreme Court. So all these issues that I just try to explain you, all these issues that came us to the point that we need to do change in the judicial reform in order for us to have any influence on the states. And if we look on the last 20 years, we'll see that in every time that a right-wing government try to make a change in Israel, if it was by legalized the settlements in Yehuda and Shomron, and if it was by taking out back to their state people, infiltrators that came into illegally to Israel, and if it was by taking by security for, I'm going to give you one very good example. 4 terrorists of Hamas was sitting in jail in Israel. After these 4 terrorists was released, they went. The Israel says they are terrorists that murdered Israeli people. We don't want them to be a citizen of Israel anymore. The law in Israel giving the government the option to take their citizenship. But the Supreme Court, when it came to the Supreme Court, the Supreme Court ruled, it says, this is not going to, you're not allowed to take their citizenships. And you have to give them the social rights and social security, and they have to get money from the state, because this is their human dignity. And if we're going to take it, it's against their human dignity. Now, this came to a point that every time that we try to do something, we stop in the Supreme Court. And eventually, if we look on democracy, we have big problem, because in democracy, you have to represent the people that get in the election. And if we don't have the option to influence on the state, people will not live in democracy anymore. We are living dictatorship. And now in Israel, we have a feeling that we are in a kind of dictatorship, but not by the government. We are in dictatorship from the court, from the judicial system. So the judicial reform is actually 4 different things that try to make these things change. One of them is how we appoint the judges for the Supreme Court. In all the democratic states in the world, in 99% of the democratic states in the world, the public is the one that actually, the representative of the public is electing the judges to the constitutional courts. because there is understanding that in the moment that you are need to rule in things that have conclusion of values, you have to represent the public. And every question of constitution is always a conclusion of values. So in every state, in Israel, no, because in Israel the judges have a veto right. Other issue of reform is about will even the Supreme Court can overrule the decision of the parliament, will have the authority to disqualify laws of the Knesset. And the reform is actually suggesting to give the Supreme Court the option to disqualify the law of the Knesset. In the first time in the history of Israel, the parliament wants to give the Supreme Court the option to disqualify laws of the Knesset. It's just saying you can do it in a certain term. For example, you need a majority of 12 Supreme Court judges from 15 in order to disqualify laws of the Knesset. Another part is going by the legal advisors. As I mentioned before, the legal advisor is very powerful and you have things but nothing doesn't exist in every other country. So what is actually the reform says, it says if the minister wants to represent, he wants to do something and there is legal advisor says you're not allowed to do it, he can take his own lawyer to represent himself in front of the court. Something very logical, but I think everyone can agree about, and it's not happening right now in Israel. And there is the override clause. Or the override clause is actually a clause that says that if the Supreme Court is overruled the decision of the parliament in some majority can override the decision of the Supreme Court. That thing is a mechanism that's supposed to make a balance between the Supreme Court option to override or the Knesset and to give a parliament the last call about the values. That's the reform. The idea about the reform is to bring back the power to the people in Israel. And I will ask Judy if you want me to go in questions or if you want me to keep going and go about these issues that are happening right in Israel, because I think I spoke to you a while.
Thank you so much, Yotam. I think that the questions will bring out some of the things that you were asking about. And so we have some very, very good questions. And for everybody who's here, what we are going to do is after the hour is up, we will turn off the recording and people can ask. Yotam has very, very kindly agreed to stay on, and people can ask any questions that they also have. So, Helene, would you like to start the questions?
Sure. I think that there's one question that that Mark Karoff asks that's really important before we even get into the other questions, which is the U.S. In the U.S. the jurisdiction of the Supreme Court is limited to questions of federal law and what is called diversity jurisdiction between citizens of different states. Is the Israel Supreme Court's jurisdiction limited in some way or unlimited?
Thank you for the question. First of all, the Supreme Court doesn't have any limited power because he decides what his power will be. Because no one gave the Supreme Court by a law, by definition, what will be his power. So the Supreme Court actually decides by himself what will be his power. So that was actually an act of power in the years, within the last 30 years, he enacted himself so much power that he's actually today can rule in every case that he wants. He made an opening for any person to go into the Supreme Court, even but he doesn't have a right of standing in front of him. And because he did it, he gave every citizen the option to go and actually appeal against everything. And that gave the Supreme Court the option to rule about every subject, because everyone can appeal and against every decision and every something, but they don't like it, it doesn't have any straight connect with them. So the Supreme Court is actually today doesn't have any restriction on its power in Israel.
Thank you. For those of you who don't know the meaning of standing, it means that you have an actual interest in the outcome of the case, as opposed to just looking on as a bystander and trying to get a ruling that will be to your liking. In America, everybody who brings any kind of lawsuit needs to have standing. So
in most of the states, in most places, Israel is very unique in this case.
Okay, I thought it was everywhere, but thank you. We have some really great questions. Paul Rogaway asks, and this is a question that many of us have on our minds: the current demonstrations, are they legal? Blocking roads, blocking the airport, blocking, if not, why isn't the government doing something about it?
So
is the proposed solution for judicial reform optimum? What would you add or subtract, and why? And will the courts try to challenge the Knesset laws for reform? What do you think will happen?
Okay, so I will start in the first question because it's actually two different questions.
Yes.
The first one is about will the demonstrations is legal or illegal in Israel. As I mentioned before, when I went as a young boy to block a road because I protest, I got arrested. And that's why it was actually something makes sense when someone going against the law and decide by himself to do whatever he wants, he needs to be arrested. But what we see right now, it's actually something pretty different, because in the last 20 years, every time that any minority try to demonstrate about issues that they cares about, if it was about evacuation of Gush Katif as me, or if it was about the Ethiopian people in Israel, but against police brutality, and if it was against the Haredi, but didn't want the Haredi people, but doesn't want to go into the army and to serve in the army. It doesn't matter which issues. Every time that someone demonstrates, we see very police brutality and a lot of people getting arrested. And suddenly, in this demonstration, the police is actually allowed to the people to block roads and allowed to the demonstrators to do whatever they want. And that's something that is actually making a lot of anger in people that used to suffer from all these things. And that takes me to the main issue. Eventually, when we're speaking about the judicial reform, about the demonstrations, we need to look about the Israel society. The Israel society is actually split to two different parts. The part of the Supreme Court people, and when I'm saying about the Supreme Court people, it's not only the people but in the Supreme Court. It's the same group but appointing the Supreme Court judges. For example, this is today we can see the pilots in the Israeli army, people that serving in elite units, in some of the elite units in the army, but they're close to people that came from other places. For example, mostly Ashkenazic, non-Sephardic places, and these people is very close to people, and these people have a lot of power because they actually in the most good place in Israel. It's the same, and people that we see in the high tech, that work in the high tech, and these people have a very strong connection with the media in Israel. And you can see now that all the media in Israel is actually going against the government. They doesn't ask themselves questions about will this reform is good or not good. They all, in the moment that the reform was represented to the public, immediately they went very strongly against the reform, and they actually supporting the demonstration. And that thing never happened in Israel because it's only going to one group, and all the other groups that I mentioned before, the settlers in Yehuda and Shomron, and the Ethiopian and the Russian and the people that living not in Tel Aviv, living in other places, are feeling that they don't have any influence on the state. And this demonstrated is actually a very good example for it, because it's showing the differences between when you are in the good place people of the society, or not in the good people of the society, in the people that have a strong connection to the judicial system, or people that doesn't have a strong connection to the judicial system, and the media the same. So that's actually in such Israel is also went into this point for years now, and people are very angry about this because they see this demonstrated stopping Israel. They blocking the main roads in Israel, and nobody do anything about it. And I, as someone that suffered from this thing, I'm very angry about it. And I think why the government doesn't do anything about it, because the government doesn't want. They know that they're doing something, but making these people very angry. So they trying to think which will be the best ways to do it without to make uprising. I mean, for example, if you going very brutality against them, that can actually look not good for the government. So we are in a very settled situation that these people that controlling the media and the what the public shown, these are people that demonstrate. So it's definitely illegal. It doesn't mean say that people are getting the same treatment about these things.
So Yotam, we spoke recently when you were in New York about the trouble of getting the message out on the mainstream media. There's also, I mean, it's very troubling. Lori Kurz brings up the fact that there was an article recently commenting that many IDF generals and lawyers are protesting. They get press about the fact that they're protesting. What's going on with the right?
So first of all, it's something that it's so easy to see that all the main officers in the army and in the police and all the head of the police and the army and the people in these places are in the same certain of mind. Because eventually, when you look at the public opinion, you'll see that more than half of the people vote in the favor of the judicial reform. But these people doesn't have any voice in the media. It doesn't have any voice in these places. For example, you all heard about the high-tech protest, because the people in the high-tech said we are actually keeping a lot of the money of the states, and we're giving a lot of money to the states in taxes. But we we're gonna take this money and taking this out of Israel. And what happened is that actually when we did a poll in between the high-tech employees just 2 days ago, they found out that there is more people but in the favor of a judicial reform in the high-tech than people against it in the high-tech. But we can't hear these voices because the media doesn't give us to these voices. It's hiding them from the public. So the most of the public in Israel supporting the judicial reform, you can see it by the different polls in different places. In the bar association, most of the bar association members are in the favor of a judicial reform. Most of the people of the students in the academic in Israel are in the favor of a judicial reform. But these voices you're not going to hear because the media is hiding them, and it's only putting in the labels only the things against the judicial reform.
Okay.
Yeah.
So do you want me to ask that or point this out? I don't know if everybody's read about this, but one of the things that has happened is international companies as well as Israeli companies themselves prefer contracts that allow them to have any disagreements adjudicated outside of Israel. They don't want the Israeli judges to be determining law for them, which is another indicator that there is a lot of support, at least within the business world, for a reform for the judges. And there's another question here that I have from, let's see, what was this other question? Here, students, I think this is the one about the students, Judy. Can I ask that one?
Sure, absolutely.
Okay, so Michael Chenkin asks, students protesting in Tel Aviv University claim the judicial reforms threaten the rights of women, Arabs, LGBTQ, and other minorities. Is this true in any way technically or politically? And are there counterbalancing safeguards in the legislation? To what extent was judicial reform discussed prior to this past election?
So there is two phrases that the protest against the judicial reform is says. Two things that they labeled as the main thing of the protest. First of all, it is the end of the democracy. You can see every place, but they says will be the end of the democracy. Why will be the end of the democracy? Because from now on, the judicial reform, the judicial system can defend the minorities in Israel. That's their excuse. But eventually, when we look about the minorities in Israel, we'll see that the Supreme Court actually never was defending the minorities. For example, look about the Haredi. Every time that something connected to the belief of the Haredi people in Israel came into the Supreme Court, the Supreme Court wasn't in their own favor. He actually doesn't let them to have the option to do events in separation by their own beliefs. Another thing is about for us. For example, the Israeli Knesset did a law that says all the settlements that we are built for the settlement in Yehuda and Shomron will be legal, and the Supreme Court disqualified it, and that was against minority, and even the Arabs suffering from the Supreme Court. So eventually, when we look at the minorities, we'll see that the minorities is actually getting hurt from the Supreme Court and not getting in the favor of the Supreme Court. So why this protesters says all the time that it's going to hurt the rights of LGBT, which we're going to be hurts the rights of the women and all this stuff, because these people is the minority that have judges that have the same agenda as him. So he knows that today in the Supreme Court, if you kept the same people in the Supreme Court, they will definitely go to your favor. And that's definitely against the democracy. And if we look, and now if I'm going to answer about even if it will hurt these things. So the Supreme Court actually never defend in the history. He didn't defend the rights of his people. For example, let's speak about the women's rights in Israel. So who made the women's rights in Israel? Since 48, in 48, the women's people in Israel got the rights to vote to the Knesset, same as the rights of women. It wasn't the same in all the other places in the world, but in Israel, everyone got the same. We had women as a prime minister. We have a right for defending women's rights in Israel, but the Knesset did. And no one even thought about changing these rights. The only questions that got coming into the Supreme Court in the last years, it wasn't about women's rights. It's about, will you take the rights of other people from deciding to do things in their own way? For example, as the Haredi, the Supreme Court says you can't do event in separation in public. Why you can't do event in separation in public, a concert in separation in public? Because it hurts the human rights of the women's rights. But if you ask the public, the Haredi public, they doesn't want to do it not separately, and you actually hurt the women's rights of the Haredi, because the women's rights of the Haredi doesn't going to have a concert because they're not going to do it separately. So eventually, if you look about this thing, you'll see that the only people that can actually defend the rights is not the court, is the people, it's us. I mean, LGBT in Israel have the same rights in the same human rights as all the other citizens in Israel. We actually have a chairman of the coalition of the Knesset. The chairman of the Knesset is LGBT, Amir Ohana. And no, and it got into the point because you have the same rights as any other. The only question by getting into the Supreme Court is not a question about their rights. It's a question about things that they want to put on the other people and make them to give them things that they doesn't have they doesn't have as a human right. For example, they want the option to get not to get married. I said about to have a baby, but women, every woman can have a right to have a baby. It doesn't care if she's LGBT or not LGBT. And a person and a man, if he wants to have a baby, he can go to a woman and do a process with women to have a baby. But now you don't ask about your option to have a baby by this way. You want the state to finance you the way to get a baby. And that thing is actually putting on us. So when you're speaking about these rights, this is the thing that getting into the Supreme Court, not about the basic human rights of these people.
Oh, this gets into a whole, everything is just so wrapped up in everything else. But I have a question for you about something that we discussed when we were sitting and having coffee. David, who I don't know who David is, says, I live in Israel. Can I meet with you and Simcha Rothman? I receive emails from the New Israel Fund every day. They have been telling their supporters since Yitzhak Shamir was prime minister that the only way to control Israel is through the Israel Supreme Court. The NIF has also been raising funds to pay people to attend rallies. What can be done about this?
Okay, so first of all, the New Israel Fund doesn't just sending these things. The New Israel Fund is actually have a program, or used to have a program, that sending lawyers into educate themselves in the ideas of the New Israel Fund, and eventually they're sending them back to the system, the judicial system in Israel, and these people are connected to the New Israel Fund. So that program actually was started at 82. Yeah, Judy.
Does everybody know what the New Israel Fund stands for?
So New Israel Fund is actually a big fund that have a lot of money getting from other people from out of Israel. And the New Israel Fund is actually a fund that have around hundreds of organizations in Israel that they are finding with the ideas about putting Israel as a all citizen state, as a non-Jewish state mostly. And what happened is that in 77, the Likud won the election. I'm sure you all, if you know Israel, there was we called it the upside down. I mean, there was something crazy in Israel. Since 48 to 77, the Labor always controlled Israel. In 77, the Likud, the first time that the right wing won the election, and the left had a very hard emotions about it. So we thought what we can do. We understand from this point, but we're not going to win the election every time since you got used to it. But what we can do in order to influence the state. So in around 82, 5 years later, they established this program that taking lawyers, very promising lawyers, mostly from the judicial system in Israel, sending them to study a master in law in different universities in United States and the UK, and later send them, if you come, obviously funding them and give them money for this period of time. Eventually tell them you have to be a volunteer in one of our organization for a year. Later you can go back to the judicial system. What happened is that in the years they got a lot of people in their own agenda into the system, and and it wasn't by accident. It was in very strong purpose. The purpose was to control Israel by the judicial system, and they actually made it. If we look on the years, we see that the judicial system took power. I mean, when they started, The judicial system, no one even thought about the judicial system as something so powerful against the government and the parliament. But what happened is that in the years they took more power, and this came from these ideas and for this agenda, because they understand that they're not going to win the election every time. But if you control the judicial system, you don't need to win the election every time. I just saw some reporter, Israeli reporter, that says we used to lose the election, but this time so we don't care about losing the election because we used to lose the election in the last 20 years. But this time they doesn't want to win the election; they want to control, and this is what I actually so scared of. They get so scared of because this is the first time that we're doing things in order to control the state, not only to win the election, but actually to control the state and to put the agendas of the public that elected our representative into the Knesset. And this is why we're so scared about the judicial reform, because now we touching the most hurtful point that they have. They know that this is the first time that we're actually taking the power back to our hands.
Oh, it's a major move, and no wonder they're very upset about it going on. Can you just explain it's confusing when you hear that people in the IDF are opposing this. Is there any reason that you can see, or is it just that they are part of the elite?
First of all, they're definitely part of the elite, because you can't see these protests in the regular places of the army. For example, I used to serve in Givati. I was in a special unit in Givati, and no one in Givati made signatures that said we are against the judicial reform, and no one in Golani that is mostly Sephardic people in Golani usually made these things. Which people signed these things against the army? Only the people in the elite units, that doesn't give the option to people from other perspectives to go into these places. For example, there is a very good organization named Forum Kohelet. Forum Kohelet is very known right now in Israel because you have a lot of people that supporting the judicial reform, and he has strong connection with Simcha Rotman and Yariv Levin, and is trying to pass the judicial reform. We are working very close. But what they did, for example, last week, people from the army reserves came into the offices of Forum Kohelet. It's not a politician; it's a research facility, and these people came to this research facility and blocked these people. They attacked the chairman of them. They attacked him physically. And who was the people that did it? The one in Matkal. You know Matkal? Matkal is the elite unit of Israel. Is the one that did Entebbe, that was in Entebbe and released the people that was ejected in the plane. So the one that did it was the guy that in charge on the exams of who will be in Matkal. So when you look on this, you understand that these people that actually use force and they belong to the elite is in charge of who will be joined to his people. So that's actually a mechanism that saves very certain groups of people. Definitely in this unit we have few people that doesn't belong to these people and doesn't think the same. But eventually, when you look on the group, it's only in these places of elite places of this elite. In the regular places in the army, people doesn't care about it. They said we are more curious about, even if we are against the judicial reform, and there is people that are against the judicial reform. I have people from a unit in the army that are against the judicial reform. They are not going to sign these things because they understand what is election, and what is to live together in a state, in democracy state. And these people doesn't understand it. These people only cares about controlling the state. And in the moment that we are going to this point about controlling the state, we see these protests in the army. and only in these places.
Well, I think you've given us a lot of food for thought, Yotam, and I think you've given us a lot of understanding of why there is such mainstream media and elite kind of lashing out against what this current government is doing. And of course, we know that this current government does represent 73% of the Israeli public in Israel. So it's great food for thought. It's great information to have, and we thank you so much for joining us today and giving us a better understanding from a legal perspective of what is really going on in Israel. So I want to thank you again and wish you the very best and wish us all the very best, because we all care about Israel so much. It's so important to all our lives. So thank you.
Thank you very much for having me.
Okay. So we're going to stop the recording now.